In order to escape the so-called callback hell that I showed you in the last lecture, let's now learn about promises, which is an ES6 feature designed specifically to deal with asynchronous JavaScript. Now, before we start, what is a promise actually? Well, it's a complex topic and it's easier to understand in practice, but in simple terms, a promise is an object that keeps track about whether a certain event has happened already or not. And if it did happen, then the promise determines what happens next. And with events here, I mean an asynchronous event, like a timer finishing or data coming back from an AJAX call, okay? So, a promise kind of implements the concept of a future value that we're expecting. It's like us saying, hey, get me some data from the server in the background. And the promise then promises us to get that data, so we can handle it in the future, okay? Does that make sense? Now, since we're dealing with time-sensitive code now, a promise can have different states. So before the event has happened, the promise is pending. Then, after the event has happened, the promise is called settled or resolved, which is the same thing, okay? Now, when the promise was actually successful, which means that the result is available, then the promise is fulfilled. But if there was an error, then the promise is rejected. Simple as that. And this is actually important to know because we will then be able to handle these two different situations in our code. Now, in more practical terms, we can produce and consume promises. So when we produce a promise, we create a new promise and send a result using that promise. Then when we consume it, we can use callback functions for fulfillment and for rejection of our promise. So let's now produce promises in order to recreate the example that we built in the last lecture and then consume those promises. And again, let's start by cleaning up here our code from the last lecture by simply commenting it out. So with promises, just like every other object type, we use the new keyword. So we say new promise, and then into that promise, we pass in a function called the executor, which is a function that will be immediately called once the promise is created. Okay, so let's just add that here as well, without actually for now adding any code. So again, an arrow function here. And so that's our promise. And of course, let's also assign this promise here to a variable. So const get IDs, okay? And that's because we're recreating the example that we had up here, okay? And so basically this first promise here will be responsible for doing that first part here with the first timer. So basically where we get these four IDs here from the server with this fake AJAX call here, okay? But now getting back to our promise here and this callback function that we pass into the promise, remember that this one here is called the executor function. And this function here itself actually takes in two arguments, which are the callback functions resolve and reject. So resolve and reject. And that's because this executor function here is used to inform the promise whether the event it is handling was successful or not. And if it was successful, we're going to call the resolve function, and if not, we call the reject function. So remember that we had these two states here, resolve if the promise was successful and reject if the promise was not successful. So if you don't have any result. And in that case, we can call the reject function. And I'm going to show you how we use these functions here inside our promise in a second. But for now, let's put some asynchronous task here in the executor function, because that is usually what happens in a promise. So something like an AJAX call, or in this case, a set timeout function. So again, to fake the AJAX call, so basically the call to a server to get some data, okay? So again, we're going to use set timeout. With a callback function after 1 second, okay? Or after 1.5 seconds, that gives us a bit more time to see the result. Now, when this timer finishes here after 1.5 seconds, we want to return the data with some of the fake IDs, just like we did before. And so now it's actually time to call that resolve function. And remember that we call resolve in case that the event was successful. So calling the resolve function here will basically mark the promise as fulfilled, so as successful, right? And that is exactly what we want here. Okay, so let's call the resolve function here. Resolve. Now that function actually takes an argument here, which is for the result of the promise. And so this is basically how we return our result from the promise if it was successful. And what do we want to return here? That's right, that's just this array of these IDs. So let me just copy it from up here and put it down here. All right. So again, what we do here is that after this timer finishes after 1.5 seconds, we say that the promise is successful and that we want to return this data here. And that's why we used the resolve function. And since set timeout is impossible to fail, so this timer will always finish, there's no way it is not going to finish. And so we don't need to call the reject function in this case. But we would need it in some other cases, like when we are dealing with data coming back from a server where there can happen all kinds of errors. But in this case, we don't need to call the reject function ever. All we do here is to call the resolve function, which marks the promise as fulfilled and returns this data here. All right, and so we produced our very first, very simple promise here, which is stored now in this getIDs variable. Okay, and so now it is actually time that we consume these promises. And in order to do that, we can use two methods on all of the promise objects. And these methods are the then and the catch methods. Okay, so all of the promise objects here inherit these two methods. And so we can now go ahead and use them. So getIDs dot then. And this then method allows us to add an event handler for the case that the promise is fulfilled. So which means that there is a result. So now all we have to do here is to pass in a callback function, which will handle what we do in case the promise was successful, which will actually always be the case here in this promise, right? So as I mentioned before, this cannot fail, and so it will always be successful, and so we can always call the then method on our promise. So let's add a callback function here, and this callback here actually can take an argument. And I'm going to explain to you in a second how this works. Okay, so I'm simply calling this one here IDs, and then an arrow function again, and then just like this. So here's the function body. Now this argument here that we pass into our callback function, which is this entire thing here, right? So this argument here will be the result of the successful promise. So in this case, it will be this entire array. Okay, and so let's now log this one to the console. So console.log IDs. And that's actually it already. So let's check it out and wait for it here. And here we go. So after 1.5 seconds again, it then printed these 4 IDs in this array here to our console. So let's recap what happened here. So we created this promise here with this executor function in it. Then inside that function, we usually have some asynchronous code, which is in this case here our set timeout, which after 1.5 seconds returns this data here in case it is successful. And that's why we use the resolve function. And the set timeout function will always be successful. And so all we need to do is to simply always use the resolve function here and then pass in the data that we want to return from the successful promise. So from the fulfilled promise. And we can then handle that successful, so that fulfilled state down here with the then methods that is available on all our promise objects. All right. So we have our promise object, and then on it, we use the then methods, which is used to handle the fulfilled promise. And into this then method, we pass in a callback function, which will always have as an argument the result of the successful promise. And that's why if we use console log of the IDs, we will basically console log this array here. Okay, does that make sense? Now, as I mentioned, we also have access to another method, which is the catch method, which allows us to add a handler for the case that the promise gets rejected, so that an error happened. So let's try that one as well. And so I'm going to chain these here in different lines. So just like this. And finally, a catch. And here we usually call the argument of the callback function the error and then we can log this error to the console. Okay, so again, right now it's impossible that this catch here is actually called because this promise here is impossible to fail. So we never called this reject callback function in here. But just to try it, let me actually use reject here instead of resolve, just so you see what happens here. And so you see the result is actually the same because we still return this data here, but this time as an error basically. So let's say we didn't have this catch here, and so now it shouldn't have any result. Okay, and so now we actually get this error here. Okay, but right now, since we're actually catching this error here, and we can also instead say something else here, just say error, and then let's try it out again. And so now it says we have an error. And again, we have an error because by using this reject function here, we basically mark this promise as rejected. And so therefore JavaScript assumes that there was an error. And so this part here is the method that gets called. Okay, but now let's put it back, of course, to resolve, because our promise is always successful. Okay, so now we translated this first part here of our previous example, and now let's write the two promises to handle the part where we get a recipe based on an ID, and then where we get another recipe based on the same publisher like we did here in this part. Okay, so let's now add these two promises, and then we can put it all together down here when we consume our promises. Okay, so let's remember how this worked up here. So we passed in an ID into the callback function of this timer, which came from the recipe IDs that we got from the first step. And so let's do something similar here. Okay, and so what we're going to do is to actually create a function which receives this ID and which will then return a promise. So let's say const get recipe, which will be a function that receives the recipe ID, and with this function body here. So again, an arrow function expression here with the new ES6 syntax. Then in here, we can return our new promise. So we return and we say new promise, just like we did up here, right? And now we need to do our executor function. And this part here is always the same. We always say resolve reject, and then pass in the function body. Okay, and now what happens inside of this promise is actually pretty similar to what we have in here. So let's just get it from this part. Okay, but instead here, of course, of the console log, we will resolve this value that we have here. Okay, so just like in our other promise, we actually want to resolve the value. And actually I'm seeing that this is not quite correct because we're still missing our set timeout here, of course. So let's add that very quickly. So set timeout. Then in here we want to pass in an ID. And then this code, of course. Then 1500 seconds. And then we pass in rec ID. So does that make sense? So into this get recipe function, we pass in rec ID, so the recipe ID, which we then pass into this set timeout. And so then it will become ID. And then inside the callback function, we use ID here. So this needs to be ID in uppercase. Okay, now how do we actually consume this promise here? So let me show it to you. So what we could do here, of course, is to simply call the get recipe function here and then add a then to it. So just like this, like get recipe with IDs 2, just like we did before, and then this would return a promise, right? And then we could add the then, and so on and so forth. But this would not really solve the problem of the callback kill, right? Because then again, we would have this callback here, this then inside of another then. And that's not ideal at all. And so there's another way of doing this. And that's actually the beauty of promises, which is something called chaining. So we can return a promise from this then method here, and then simply add the next then method after it. So let me show that to you so that it makes more sense. So I do it like this: return get recipe IDs 2, and then I can add the next then after this. This get recipe here will return a promise. Okay, so after this here runs, we will have a promise here. And what we do then is to return that promise. And therefore we can then add the next then to handle the result of that resolved promise. Okay, so we now have this promise here and now want to handle the fulfillment of this new promise. Okay, and what will happen when this promise is fulfilled is that it will basically return this data here. Okay, and that is our recipe. So let's call this parameter of this callback function here the recipe, and then simply log it to the console. And let's try it out here. So the IDs, and then finally the recipe. So it's working just fine without any of the callback hell that we had up here, right? So now our code is all nicely separated here into these different functions. And then down here we consume these promises. We could of course put this one here into a function as well, but that's not really necessary because we don't need to pass any data into this. So here this get recipe, we did it as a function because we needed to pass in this recipe ID into this promise here. Okay, and so that's the second one. And now finally let's work on the last one. So let's add another function here called getRelated. And remember that this one here is basically to fetch a recipe which is related to the author of the first recipe. And so of course this needs to happen in a sequence because we can only load a related recipe if we already know the publisher that we're looking for. And so we need to do this in these 3 steps just like we did before. So again, return a new promise, then resolve and reject. And again, this is always like the same here. And oh, I forgot to put the parentheses here for the arrow function. And then again here the set timeout. Let's just say pub here. After 1.5 seconds, so 1500 milliseconds, and then the publisher. So just the same logic as before. So this publisher is the one that we get here as an input to this function, which will then be passed into the callback function of the set timeout and will then be called pub. Okay, and now I'm just going to copy the code that we have up here again and simply paste it here. And again, we don't want to log it to the console, but we want to resolve this promise and return this recipe here. So recipe, and let's call it recipe here as well. And let's actually also use this pub argument. I think up there we didn't actually use it, but let's do that down here. So let's use a template literal here again. And say pub, and then show the recipe here. So the Italian pizza. Okay, and so that should get the job done. And so now, in order to consume this promise, I'm going to do it in the exact same way as before. So we receive our recipe here, and now I will return the result of calling getRelated. So getRelated, and what we passed in here then is the recipe.publisher, right? So recipe.publisher, because that's in this case here Jonas, right? So we get Jonas from our recipe and then pass it into the getRelated function. And so all of this here will return a new promise. And so just like before, we can then use the then method on it. And again, we receive a recipe, and so I can call it recipe again, because it's a different function than this one here, and so I can simply reuse this name. And so now let's again log this recipe to the console. Give it a save, and let's try it out. So after 1.5 seconds this one, then the first recipe, and then the related recipe. And now we get an error here saying undefined, and then this weird object. And I think I know why this is happening, and that's because our recipe here actually returns a string. Okay, so you see here that we actually resolve this entire string here and not just the recipe object. And so therefore we can then not read a recipe.publisher. Okay, and so instead I'm simply going to add Jonas here. Okay, so in this case it doesn't really matter. And so that solves this first part here. Then after that I have object, and that's because here I put this entire object here into a string, but instead I just want recipe.title, just like we have here in this line of code as well. Okay, and if I do this now, then it should work. And now finally, yeah, so Jonas Italian pizza. I could of course pass something else here, just like my entire name. And so 1.5 and 1.5, and finally another 1.5 later, we get this entire result. Okay, so that's how we do the same thing that we did before with the callback hell with promises. So instead of having this really messy and unmanageable code, which is actually a lot less code here, but it still is really unmanageable, especially if we had more code and deeper nested callbacks, then it would become really like a nightmare to maintain. And instead, we have very nicely separated code here like this, where we produced all of our promises, and then in the end, we simply consumed them here with this chain of thens, and finally then a catch to catch if there's any error. And that's it about promises. Pooh, this was a lot to take in. And I find promises to be one of the hardest, if not the hardest concept to grasp in JavaScript. And so please don't worry if you didn't really understand it 100% on this point, okay? Because what really matters is actually how we consume promises and not so much how we produce. Because that is oftentimes already included in some kind of libraries that we're going to use later in the course.